Good morning. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Pearl Sokulu, and I am the MD of Vuma 103, a KZN-based regional radio station which broadcasts from Port Shepstone to Richards Bay with a focus on urban KZN. I am also your moderator for this morning's discussion. So on that note, I would like to welcome you to this installment in the digital series called Paradigm Shift, brought to you by Arena Holdings together with our partners Vodacom and Easy Ads, The Media Shop, Proudly SA, and Everlytic. Now, as you know, today's topic is called Adapt and Thrive, the future of media. We're going to be talking about advertising anthropology, the changing ways that media is being consumed by consumers, shifts in consumer behavior, and the adoption of technology in this context. Now, the media industry at large has undergone unprecedented period of change and disruption. And the rapid innovation in technology and the adoption of new media platforms has seriously challenged some of our legacy brands and companies. But simultaneously, this offers some real opportunity for those leaders who are willing to shift and willing to embrace technology. So for those brands which can weather this disruption that has been brought about by technology, by globalisation, and most recently even a pandemic, are the ones that will thrive into the future. To help us to delve a little bit deeper into the topic of advertising anthropology, into trends and trend setting, changes in consumer behavior and the way that media is consumed, and the general adoption of innovation and technology by brands, by people, and by companies. We are joined by an esteemed panel who I'd like to introduce to you now. Firstly, Adam Gottlich, Head of Behavioral Science at Standard Bank. Welcome to Adam. Adam, if we could just have, wonderful to have you. Adam, perhaps if you could just give everyone a slight overview of some of your experience.
Absolutely. So I am Head of Behavioral Science for Standard Bank Wealth, and I previously studied in the Netherlands. I did a master's degree in economic and consumer psychology, and my day-to-day job really is about understanding how and why people make the decisions that they do, and helping people in general to make better financial decisions.
Thank you and welcome, Adam. Bronwyn Williams is a trained translator and a future finance specialist at Flux Trends. Welcome to you, Bronwyn.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I work with Dion Chang. I'm a partner there at the Flux Trends Consultancy, and we help businesses understand what consumer, economic, and political trends mean for their businesses. And we try to unpack those trends, not just as being things of interest, but rather things that are being of strategic insight to their business strategy going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bronwyn. And over to Chris Buerter, who is the Group Managing Director at Park Advertising. Welcome, Chris.
Hello, Paul. Thank you very much for the opportunity today. So as you said, I'm the Group Managing Director of Park Advertising. Park Advertising is the holding company for two of South Africa's biggest media agencies, being the Media Shop and Meta Media. I've been in the media industry for 20 years now, and worked for the group for 17, 18 of those. So yeah, so lifetime servant.
Wonderful to have you, Chris. And finally, but not least, Claire Denham-Dyson, the head anthropologist at Demographica. Welcome to you, Claire.
Hi, Pearl. Thanks. Yeah, I'm head anthropologist at Demographica, and we focus exclusively on B2B. So we look at how organizations buy, the DMU or decision-making unit that gets involved in the buying decision, and what motivates people on a really human level to make those decisions.
Wonderful. Welcome to all our panelists. And I think that we're all really lucky to have such an incredible panel this morning. So let's dive straight into it. Perhaps if I can start with you, Adam. Over the past decade, advertising has really become a lot more about human connection. And I think brands and agencies are really aware that they have to associate on a much deeper level with their consumer. Anthropology takes this a little bit deeper, doesn't it? And why do you think that this level of consumer understanding has now become so much more important than in the past?
It's a very good question. And I mean, if I could talk to, why behavioral science has become so important in the last decade as well, is for that exact reason. It's about understanding people on a fundamental level. And in general, behavioral science has three core assumptions that it makes about people. It says that people are irrational, we have unstable preferences, and we constantly make decisions that undermine our utility. And what that means practically is that if you've ever bought a pair of shoes on sale that you didn't really want, but they were on sale, and they don't really fit that well, and they're quite uncomfortable, but instead of turfing them, they sit quietly in the back of your closet, you've nailed all three assumptions in one go. And really what it speaks to is understanding people as we truly are and not as we imagine them to be. And sometimes we do imagine ourselves to be these rational comparison machines, taking all the information at our disposal to make the best decisions. And that's just absolutely not the case. It's fitting that today is called Adapt and Thrive, because primarily that has been our biggest survival advantage over the course of human history, adaptation. And really, we operate on the belief that we are adaptive, and the environment disproportionately influences our behavior. So if we understand that, we start to understand people much more meaningfully. And if we understand people more in a deeper sense, in a true context, it means that we can connect with them properly. And maybe just one example of this, it's probably my favorite example from behavioral economics, is called the peak end rule. And it basically says that the way people evaluate or retrospective experiences is through an average of the peak of an experience and its end. And what that tells us is that the end of an experience is unbelievably important in the way that people remember the overall experience. So by understanding people, what drives them, how they are likely to respond and behave, it's a good indication of how we can better connect with them.
I like what you say. Human beings are irrational, and we absolutely are. And I like your point about how we want to understand people as they truly are, as opposed to what we think they are. So how does the use of technology and the changes, shifts in that landscape help us better understand who people truly are, who the consumer that we're talking to truly is, as opposed to all of these assumptions that we make up all the time?
So I think the emergence of data and technology as a sort of key theme driving, advertising and engagement is definitely something that allows us to see into or see behind the curtain as to, who people are and what really drives their decision-making behavior. And if we think about, this pandemic and what's been happening over the last couple of weeks and months, really we've seen a big shift in how people are not only consuming media, but also how they're responding to technology. There's, a meme that's been going around to say, what has driven your digital adoption strategy? And if it's COVID-19, you've been a bit behind the curve, but we are expecting it to create significant leaps forward in people's ability to consume digital technology and to be on platforms that brands can actually reach them and really engage them meaningfully. I think the important thing to understand is how do people respond to different forms of technology? What drives their decision making in terms of how they use it? Where do they fall on adoption curves? Because not everybody has the same level of proficiency when it comes to digital technology. And generally, what people consume and who they follow is a great indicator about their personal beliefs, about what is important to them. And really, I think we're going to start to see more and more start viewing social media as people's own echo chambers, where they follow people who have the same sort of ideas, thoughts, and beliefs as themselves, meaning that somebody's followers and who they're following could become a great indication of what's important to them. And if we start to understand that, we can connect very meaningfully with people.
I think that's a good point. Perhaps to ask you, Bronwyn, with technology giving us being such a powerful new tool for enhancing the client or consumer experience, how do you feel digital communication and social media have impacted consumer brand interactions and relationships? And what is the role that social media specifically has played in sharing information?
Well, I think the first point is, it's quite obvious, is that it's opened up a two-way communication stream between clients and the brands that they interact with, which wasn't really the case even when I was growing up. And I'm part of, like, the, as we'd say, the millennial generation, as much as I hate to talk about sort of generational stereotypes. When I was growing up, brands sort of were in full control of the message that they put out to consumers. Whereas today, consumers can reflect back on those brands. And that opens up a lot of risk for brands. I think my favorite example here would be in the UK. So we all know how fraught their whole Brexit situation was and how polarized the entire country was around politics. And brands inadvertently find themselves in the midst of these culture wars, even if they try to opt out of them. So as I said, my favorite example there would be the British Chancellor, the new one that has just been elected into that position, posted a picture quite innocently on his own social media feed on Twitter, posing with his favorite brand of tea. And Twitter went entirely insane, and people started wanting to boycott the tea brand because a politician they didn't like was seen using it. And then, of course, other people supported that tea brand, not because they liked the brand, because the right person was seen with it. Now, of course, the brand had nothing to do with this. The politician was not paid to pose with that particular packet of tea, but they still had to deal with the fallout. And I think that's the lesson that brands need to understand in the social media age, is that you can't opt out of politics inadvertently or vertently, if I have a correct word to say that. You're going to find yourself in the midst of this increasingly binary, increasingly polarized, increasingly politicized space that social media has become.
So I love that. It's a really important point to say that it's now a two-way communication. We're not speaking at people. We're not telling them how they must perceive brands and what they must believe or not believe. Chris, from your perspective, how has this change and this increase of two-way communication changed the way that the advertising industry delivers their product or service?
I think there's two parts to it. I think there's back in the days, the role of a PR person, if you want to call it that, was vastly different to what it is today. The term community management, I think, is critical nowadays in terms of how you manage your community of people who follow you and engage with you, but also your broader community. In terms of people who don't follow you, the tea example is a fantastic example of people wanting to engage with your brand, whether they like you or don't like you, or don't necessarily engage with you. So I think that so that's the first piece for me in terms of us as a group, as communicators, having a broader perspective in terms of how and where we communicate. I think the second piece to it is the data piece. I think nowadays, and Adam spoke about it earlier on, I think now brands and platforms know more about their customers than sometimes the customers themselves know. If you go look at what Google and Facebook know about us, they know every stroke of your cursor, right? How long you pause over a piece of content, whether you click on it, whether you like on it, whether you dislike it. I mean, it's terrifying actually to know what technology knows about you. So that layer of data from a media perspective has been fascinating. If one overlays that from an advertising communication perspective, how that adds to being what we call niche mass media. In other words, you can talk to people who are interested in a car, and you can talk to 200, 300, 400,000 of them at a time, where back in the day, you put your TV ad on. If somebody saw your TV ad, they saw it. If they didn't see it, they didn't see it. So I'd say those are the two pieces, the data layer and the interaction layer. I think that's been big changes.
Absolutely. Bronwyn, as Chris says, the things that technology knows about us, it's a little bit scary, quite frankly, but the amount of information that's available about our consumers is completely unprecedented. But which technical hurdles need to be overcome in South Africa for us to fully exploit the power of technology and the innovation that the globe is actually experiencing at the moment? Bronwyn?
Well, I suppose a slightly contrary take on that. I don't think that there is much holding us back from that at this point of time at all. I don't think that lack of access to internet is as big an issue as it was a few years ago. We've got multinational tech companies coming in, offering people entirely free Wi-Fi. We've got even big corporates here in South Africa stepping up. I mean, we've had big giants here during COVID alone offering free educational services on certain URLs. So I think that those challenges are, if not solved, quite easily solvable for most people. think the big issue when it comes to connecting with consumers with technology is actually an over-reliance on what technology can really do. So as much as you were talking earlier about technology knowing everything about you and collecting all of your data in real life from your location and from your keystrokes, whether you're on social media, that's all true. But data is kind of meaningless unless you apply insight to it. And quite frankly, if you've done any sort of web shopping lately, if you've searched for a lawnmower, which is very much a one-off purchase, even after you've purchased a lawnmower, you're still going to be followed by lawnmower ads, probably for the rest of your natural life. Because when you start automating things, there's a very big difference between automating efficiency and automating inefficiencies. And I've got files and files of case studies of how technology is not as smart as it appears. And for me, then the danger becomes actually relying on technology simply because it is technology to inform decisions, when the technology is actually not as smart as we think it is. And then we can start delegating responsibility as both individuals and as organizations to the appearance of a smart, omniscient presence of the all-knowing tech machines, when in fact that intelligence and nuance is still lacking.
So there's a danger in relying too heavily on just the data. So Claire, as an anthropologist, perhaps if you can talk a bit about the important role that anthropology has played or is playing in understanding human behavior and societies in an advertising context, both in the past and in the present, and more specifically right now through this crazy time of lockdown.
Yeah, thanks, Pearl. I think, anthro has really not been something that's been very close to advertising for the last, 50 years. Advertising's really been dominated by psychology. So looking more at mindsets and motivations, whereas anthropology focuses a lot on culture, behavior, ritual, habit, and really tries to put the observer in a position where they're also engaging in that world. So I think, it's important for me because people are, as Adam kind of referenced, people are storytellers, and we connect with stories. So those things that we tell ourselves, those irrationalities that we have, those justifications that we create, that's all part of the story that we make up about our lives and our world. And anthropologists, I think, have quite a key understanding of how we tell those stories to ourselves and to others through things like digital media. So yeah, I think right now what we're seeing, I've been having an ongoing conversation actually with a colleague of mine around trust, because obviously that's one of the most important things that sort of come out of this whole COVID pandemic, is that trust is kind of being thrown into this completely new light. It's kind of it's almost associated with morality in a way. So being clean, brands being hygienic, showing that they are doing all the necessary steps, social distancing, acting responsibly, that's now a moral issue. So I think that's a really interesting shift, is to see how hygiene has become this huge talking point, and become very tied up in morality. And yeah, ultimately trust. I think people are reevaluating both in B2B and in B2C how they make decisions, why they make decisions, and I think sometimes maybe shifting their attention and their energy into different kinds of decisions. So we probably in some cases are making much more frivolous decisions, buying the shoes online that we really don't need because we've got 15 minutes to fill, versus thinking about something like insurance that Adam was talking about earlier, and stopping insurance when really you should be holding on to it. So it's those kind of things. And I think anthropology should really help us try to understand what are these stories that people are telling themselves, and how do we slot in? What is the role of brands that we need to play? I do believe we need to stop being, as an industry, quite so clever and start to become a little bit more useful in people's lives.
So definitely some changes in terms of what's top of mind. You talk about the changes and people just thinking about hygiene, morality, and reevaluating how they make their decisions and what's important and what isn't. Adam, how have media preferences changed as a result of the lockdown, do you think, and isolation?
So I don't necessarily think it's all about change. In some segments, we are seeing change, but in most segments, we're seeing just increased consumption. So Global Web Index studies found that 80% of consumers are actually just consuming more of what they were doing previously. It's because they have more time on their hands, and we know that people are driven by engagement and gratification. So, typically across generational segments, we're seeing people consuming more online videos, specifically millennials and Gen Zs. They're playing more online video games. It's also a way to collaborate and socialize with people, which is sort of a core driving force of human behavior, is the need to connect socially. So people are using, social media and things like that to really connect with other people with whom they've been separated from. So we are seeing definitely, generational differences. And in boomers, for example, they are consuming the most amount of TV compared to any other generational segment. But Gen Zs are the ones who are actually looking like they would be more likely to adopt new things post this pandemic. So, more than a third say they would be keen to now pay for Netflix and Disney Plus because they've spent the time exploring new things that could add a richness to their environment and their circumstances. I think people are quite concerned at the moment with getting an ROI on their purchases. And that doesn't mean a return on investment that's purely financial. It can be, social. It can be a happiness premium even. There's a desire to be fulfilled. One interesting thing, I think, is that we've also seen the increasing popularity of shows and movies about pandemics. So people are watching more and more about pandemics. And in my mind, from a psychological perspective, I think it speaks to the need for people to fictionalize some of the chaos that we find ourselves in. And also, movies and series also generally have an end point and an end that, a hero wins out and the day returns to normal. And I think people are seeking for that sort of normality. So that's an interesting trend that's popped up in terms of how people are consuming, different forms of media.
So Chris, Adam says people are consuming more of what they were consuming before, but there is a move to an increased almost binging of online videos and games, and people are exploring some new things too that may enrich their personal experience, their brand experience. But from your point of view, what are the ways that brands gain and lose meaning in an environment like this?
Yeah, look, I think from a media perspective, let me maybe just add to what Adam said earlier on. I think from a media perspective, some of the losers we've seen, by the way, has been I think the outdoor industry's taken a beating. As we've seen over the past 5 weeks, people haven't been out on the road. So as a platform, outdoor has struggled. And I think the other big one that struggled has been print. We saw a couple of the big titles. I mean, Associated Magazines closed down, Caxton's Magazines closed down all within the past couple of weeks. Titles like Cosmo and Fair Lady that was part of our essence as a country closing down, which is brutal. To your question, though, in terms of brands and how brands react to it, I think that the big thing that I've noticed is that there is a far bigger need for accountability for brands nowadays from a consumer perspective. I think consumers are, let's use old terms, simpler, better, faster, today, tomorrow, together, whatever your payoff line is. I think that if you claim to be there for me today, tomorrow, together, you better be there for me today, tomorrow, together, because now in a time of crisis is when I want to see you step up. It's all good and well when things are hunky-dory and flourishing that you're promising that you're going to be there for me. But I think we've seen it with a lot of industries where, especially the financial services industry is a big one, where that promise of security is always a big one. And I think banks and financial services institutions in general, there's a big magnifying glass on them at the moment to make sure that they live up to that. And we've seen the banks do payment holidays on certain loans, and we've seen some banks get a bit of a hiding when they make a payment holiday, but actually just extend the terms at the back end of it. So I think I've been fascinated to see how brands are now, especially on social media, being held massively accountable for what their promise is in good times.
So people want their brands to deliver on the promises, and back to this whole thing of it not just being this one-way communication, like Bronwyn was saying. It's a two-way communication, and we are holding those brands accountable. Now, how do you think that these this rapid advancement in technology has made that all the more difficult for the brand owners.
I mean, you just got to look at Twitter, go look at Facebook, go look at any social media platform. I think that's the challenge. Is if you can not live up to your brand promise to 2 or 3 consumers. If those 2 or 3 consumers make a loud enough noise about it on social media, it can actually turn into a storm. So, I mean, I think a fascinating example was just before COVID when we had, I think it was Old Mutual, where somebody didn't deliver, they didn't pay out on a funeral policy, and the person physically brought the body to the Old Mutual head offices to try and prove that the death. And I mean, it blew up on social media. So I think that the fact that everybody now has a voice, you know, there's the old adage of be careful of the guy who's got the pen because he's going to have the final say. I think now it's about be careful of the guy who's got the big social media following because he's the one who's going to have the final say, and brands have very little control over that.
Absolutely. So this is the view of the consumer, but what of the view from your client side? You know, what are clients expecting? We know what consumers are expecting now, but what are your clients expecting now? And how are they placing more pressure on you as the advertising expert?
I think a couple of things. I think for starters is agility, I think, is critical. I can tell you now, if you're going to look back at what's happening in we had the announcement from the president earlier this week. Then we had the follow-up last night with Minister Dlamini speaking a little bit about the implications. So I think brands are now expecting us as agencies and business partners to be true business partners, right? So if your brand is struggling and they want to cut fees and they want to make sure that they get the extra bang for their buck, that's what we do. And agility. I mean, a great example. One of our clients, Nedbank, they had a TV campaign that was supposed to go live. They couldn't record the ad in the end. As I think it was Joe Public was the creative agency. They ended up shooting the ad on a cell phone within a day or two, and the ad went live. So I think it's that responsiveness, partnership, and agility. I think are 3 key words that brands are looking for now from their agencies.
Yeah. So to Claire, you know, in the past, the term brand influencer almost didn't exist, but in the past couple of years, that's become all the rage. And, you know, every other brand wants to have some kind of influencer subliminally, you know, encouraging consumers to get involved with their brand. Let's talk about this shift towards brand influencers.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's been understandable in a way, because I mean, we've spoken a lot about you know, how people need to feel as though there's humanity at the end of something. So I think we've seen the uptick because people want to see other people, people want to see fallibility, they want to see people you know, taking responsibility, they want to see realness, I think, with a of fakeness as well, which I think is the kind of comfortable tension that we all enjoy about influencers. You know, there's on one hand kind of this this buying into product placements, and you know, I lost so many kilograms by drinking this amazing tea, and yet there's a part of us that knows intrinsically that's not real. So I think that I can understand the uptick in B2C. But I think it'll be interesting to see what that looks like in B2B, because that is slowly maturing a little bit, and I think we're getting a lot more kind of aware of the use that influencers can, or the value that influencers can bring to B2B brands, because we're talking to much smaller audiences, sometimes much more engaged audiences. So yeah, hopefully that will continue. But I do think that it'll be interesting to see where technology continues to play a role there, because they're under fire just as much as brands in terms of the kind of claims that they make. To Chris's point, you know, they need to still remain accountable, and I think we've seen a huge backlash actually in the last couple of years around influencers saying things that aren't believable, and kind of other influencers holding them accountable to that. So there's this weird kind of competitive stage also that this is playing out on on social media. And I think there's a drama to that people love, actually. Yeah.
So this drama, this back and forth communication, it seems to me that it's almost as if brands are being co-created. It's no longer, a case of we decide what the brand is and what it's going to mean to you. So how is meaning affected when agencies and brands co-create in entirely new ways?
I think, it's quite a broad question, because ultimately, at its core, we should be working directly with our brands. We should be co-creating everything. There's always that adage of, the huge, at least in B2B, the huge kind of gap between sales and marketing. And I think often we find in the advertising industry, the gap between agencies and brands, brands not understanding, or agencies not understanding their brands, and actually brands not understanding what their agencies should be doing. So yes, I think co-create seems to be a relatively popular buzzword also at the moment. Everybody feels like there's a need for multiple opinions, because we are living in this kind of global village where there is the opportunity to speak from many different positionalities. So I think hopefully what will happen is that because we get all of these voices in a room, or because we get more diverse voices in a room, that co-creation will become a little bit more authentic and a bit more real. I just hope that people do take that to heart, and that they don't, take a backseat or a passive seat, whether you be a brand or an agency, and not take a kind of a really strong or engaged role in informing that story about your brand and about your agency.
Bronwyn, from your point of view, any examples of some, really great, some co-creating happening in your area with Flux Trends?
I can't really say that we've seen much happening here in terms of co-creating. I suppose what we've seen more of lately is adaptability and pivoting, or that's just such a terrible cliched management word at the moment, but like brands having to reposition themselves to work within the new types of creative constraints that COVID has obviously dumped on the whole entire world at the moment. I think that the collaborations are something that we'll probably see more of going forward, particularly with bigger companies starting to work with smaller ones. A lot of small companies obviously not going to make it through this next period. I think the Heavy Chef survey said, well, the one they looked at, 3 out of 4 South African SMEs don't believe they're going to make it through the lockdown, let alone through the rest of the year. And I think bigger businesses have realized, certainly amongst the clients that we have definitely noticed this, that they are noticing that as a sense of future opportunity, that they are seeing these smaller companies, their actual former competitors, as an opportunity for future mergers and acquisitions, which is quite interesting. So that could see a bit of new invigoration going on in bigger companies across South Africa. But at the same time, it could also be quite a tragedy from a consumer perspective, because obviously less companies to trade with means less choice. And that means, of course, less of your needs being fulfilled, because obviously from a consumer point of view, the more companies that you can interact with, the better.
Absolutely. There's been an incredible amount of change, some of it positive, some of it negative. But as we said in the beginning, really, it's about brands being able to adjust, adapt, and embrace technology. And we see quite a lot of examples of that. Brands who'd already been doing this prior to COVID-19 are obviously not struggling at all, the likes of One Day Only, the likes of Uber, etc. But it's also had a huge change in the way that we operate as an industry. Advertising and marketing professionals are pretty well known for working under pressure and under long hours, for long hours. How do you see the way that we work changing from digital burnout eventually? And how will this affect our businesses?
That's quite an interesting question. I think that if you've attended our Flux Trends presentations in the past, we refer back to this quote from one medical study quite a lot, and that's they say that your supervisor is more important to your mental health than your GP or your physician these days, because of the way that our work and home lives have become so overlapped. And burnout is a huge issue. So for my clients in the insurance space, for my clients in the health space, we've definitely seen that mental health issues, particularly stress and burnout related mental health issues, are something that is going to affect both employees and employers going forward. So obviously, if your staff, your general staff complement your employees, are burned out and stressed, that has a direct implication on productivity. At the same time, if you believe that your boss is concerned about your productivity, you start to put in more work more hours, get more stressed, and those burnout spirals, those negative vicious circles happen very, very quickly. And this is something we're definitely seeing with COVID at the moment. We are definitely seeing an increase in all kinds of mental health issues, particularly with people working from home who now no longer have clear boundaries of third spaces, of that commute from their office place to their homes. So without having that dead time, we find that work tends to take over our family life rather than the other way around. And this is not good for creativity. It's not good for innovation, and it's definitely not good for either side of the business, either the employer or the employee.
Now, perhaps, Adam, if we can talk a little bit about, in this vein, is there such a thing as just too much technology and taking it a little bit too far in the advertising context?
I mean, absolutely. I think Bronwyn's point is so valid at the moment. I think that people are, on the verge of burnout. And I think, we are really in the age of information overload. If you just think about it practically, we as individuals in the last 2 weeks, there's quite an astonishing statistic. So as individuals in the last 2 weeks, we have been exposed to more data than any of our, ancestors prior to our great-grandparents combined. So it means that we are living in an increasingly complex world. We are, struggling with information overload. And I think that people are starting to get a little bit worried about their screen time. And certainly I think that the lines between work and home are becoming increasingly blurred as people start to adjust to, this new normal situation. So certainly I think, the WHO has, even prior to this pandemic, raised the issue of screen time as a concern, where people are spending too much time. We've seen a couple of studies in terms of mental health, in terms of people who, the rates of depression and anxiety are higher for people who spend more time online. And some of the reasons are quite interesting. They see more time, they spend more time seeing what other people are doing. They feel left out of that. They feel that there's an expectation that they can't, match up to. There's a world out there that they don't, in some instances, have access to, especially when it comes to, celebrities and influencers and things like that. So I think certainly we have to be aware of the impact of technology, and sometimes there is too much. However, I do think it's something that's here to stay, and I think it is not something we can run away from. I think the question more becomes, how do we use it productively to engage people meaningfully so that they don't feel overwhelmed? And through, the things like data science and personalization, people start to see things that are relevant to them. So to Bronwyn's example earlier, they aren't haunted for the rest of their lives with a lawnmower.
Right. So, we've all read about how the lockdown, it can quite likely lead to depression. I have a question from Barry to you, Adam, and he asks, do you think within the pandemic, people are more prone to purchasing in a state of fear to better their emotional state, or driven by programmatic marketing? Is emotional not the driver?
So emotion is a huge driver of human behavior. I mean, we are emotional decision makers, and I think that's a founding belief in behavioral science. So fear is a way that we have adapted to our environment over time. So fear is what has driven a huge amount of survival. I mean, we have an area of our brain dedicated to, fight or flight. And it is a massive driver, and we absolutely do things, out of fear. We buy things because of, the potential implications that we see or the consequences, and fear is driving those things. But in terms of buying things to make us feel better, that's actually a concept around ego depletion. So we tend to buy things like status goods to help us feel better about the environment that we're in. In the last global financial crisis in 2008, we actually saw the global sales of ice cream increase by 170%. So people were looking for things that were going to make them feel a little bit better. So fear is, has two streams. It drives decision making in terms of uncertainty. It's a way for us to take control over the world. We make decisions to take control over a world that is so beyond our control. And then we look to things like status goods and luxury goods to help us feel a little bit better about the environment and the situation we find ourselves in.
Right. So, Chris, preying on people's fears is no new concept when it comes to advertising. But surely there is some kind of ethical balance to be struck here.
Absolutely. Yeah, look, I think it's been proven a number of times over, and I'm sure Adam will be able to give me more stats on it. But with things like alcohol advertising, if you use fear as your gear, in other words, show somebody drunk driving in a massive car wreck and bodies lying strewn all over the place, it's got a significantly worse response very often, because fear does then trigger a negative response or an inevitability response, which isn't ideal. So I don't think it's necessarily, from an advertising perspective, the right trigger to use to elicit a response at all, although it has been done in the past. So I think for me, I would far more rather focus on the positive element of drive and motivation.
Absolutely. And from your point of view, Claire, we seem to know a lot more about our consumers right now. I think earlier, Chris, it was you who mentioned that technology knows more about us than we know about our friends, for example. What is this doing to our society, though, Claire? How is this changing the way that we interact with one another? And is this healthy?
Is it healthy? I'm not sure. I think it depends where you are in your life. I mean, I think we were speaking a bit earlier about digital adoption, and I think that's one thing that's been really kind of interesting for us from our B2B clients' perspective. I had an interesting conversation with one of our clients. They're seeing that their salespeople who have been focused on getting digital interactions into real life are now almost having to retrain themselves from wanting those real interactions back into having those digital interactions. So I think it's shifting. It's shifting, at least from the B2B side, quite a lot. Also, I mean, as we spoke about earlier, again, with the different generational kind of adoptions of tech, I've seen quite a lot of fear around people not being able to use things like Zoom and Skype and not feeling proficient in them, therefore not being able to show their expertise and feeling like they're kind of at a disadvantage in that way. So I think, I mean, we speak a lot about like this new normal and what it's going to look like in a year's time. I read a scathing article this morning from Mark Ritson, one of our favorites, around how this is not a new normal. Things will continue as usual. We shouldn't kind of be reactive. We should slow down, calm down, and see what happens on the other side of it a little bit. And I think that's an interesting take, because we have been quite sort of, everybody's been talking about how COVID is going to change us. And when you look at a lot of the advertising around COVID, it's quite wallpapery. It's all, I saw a great kind of chopping in of a whole bunch of different ads, and they all have the same storyline. We're here together, apart, da 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 da. It's the same storyline. So I think it'll be interesting to see if that narrative shifts or changes. And I mean, another thing that's been quite interesting is internally having that conversation with my colleagues around, will things actually change? Or will things just go back to the way that they were because people miss normal life? Will it get worse? Will we, spend more time actually in person to person because we're sick of our technology? I highly doubt that, but I just think we don't know. We don't know so much. The future is dark. But I think that does make it really exciting for marketers and for brands, because we can shape a bit of that future.
On that note, we actually have a comment from Louise to both you and Adam. How do we pursue the digital era while keeping the interests of humanity being social beings intact. You know, we have thousands and thousands of friends on Facebook. We have millions of followers, but really that true human social interaction and that real connection is being lost, isn't it?
Yes, but I think as we've said, like it's not completely lost. It's just changing. But I do think that there could be definitely a sense of loss from people. We're grieving a lot of those things that we had before. You know, we're grieving being able to see our friends. We're grieving being able to visit our family. So I don't think that it will change. We are still social beings. We're still going to be motivated to connect with one another. We will find other ways to do that. And I think the question for me would be, what is the role that brands should play? Because, you know, can brands be empathetic is the question. Can brands fill a little bit of that void where we feel like we're not getting that social engagement? I don't know, Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, so for me, I think the driving force has to be around human experiences that are enabled digitally. And I mean, if we all think back to the 2010 World Cup, right? I think that is a moment in time in South Africa that all of us have vivid memories around because it was so emotional. I mean, if you look at what technology we were using back then, and 10 years later, the world has like fundamentally shifted. WhatsApp wasn't a thing. People were still using BBM and Mixit. And, Instagram was kind of just launching. Twitter hadn't launched until a little bit later. And what that means is that change happens incrementally and quite fast all at the same time. It sort of creeps up on us and then alters the way that we sort of see and appraise the world. What I would say is that people are adaptable by nature. And I think that as, new tools are sort of introduced into the market to help create the sort of closeness, I think that we'll see people adopting them and adapting to them as well. I mean, we can look at, things that people have used during, lockdowns like House Party and, finding new ways to engage with people. So in my mind, it's not about losing the social connection we have. And I think it's more about saying, how does that come of age in the new sort of increasingly digital world? And I think for the first time, we're also starting to see a world connected, a world together, talking about the same thing. And for the first time, I think we have the opportunity to connect with people on a global scale in a meaningful way. And I think as we progress, it's just about saying, can brands create human experiences on their digital platforms that create the sense of authenticity and trust in order to, win the hearts and minds of their consumers?
Absolutely. That's a very difficult one, creating that close interpersonal connection with consumers in a time when we couldn't be further apart really physically, and using technology to do it. But it does make me think about the importance of brand purpose to consumers too, Chris. Let's talk a little bit about brand purpose to consumers. How has purpose-driven marketing changed in the past 2 months, and what can brands do in the most authentic way to connect with our consumers, especially since most people are extremely sensitive right now?
Look, I think at the gates, when it comes to brand purpose, the amount of brands that a consumer engages with on an ongoing basis is massive. I think Claire spoke about it a little bit earlier on. I think the change, it's not a change that we've seen, it's an evolution maybe that we've seen, is again that accountability that I spoke about earlier on. If you are, I use the example of a ShopRite. If their product line is lowest prices every day guaranteed. If your brand purpose is built around value for the consumer, right? It's at this time is the time when value is required, right? That's something that you now need to live up to. But I think it's even extended. I mean, and again, let me build a bit my ShopRite example that I gave earlier on is that they ran a brilliant campaign during lockdown where they weren't promoting necessarily wanting to be the lowest price every day, guaranteed, right? But where they spoke about how the cashiers and the people who work in the store are actually frontline workers in their own right in terms of their interaction that they have with people on a day-to-day basis. So I think from a purpose perspective, we've seen brands evolve. So I think there's the foundation that you have to build on, that you have to live up to. And again, I want to stress that for me has been the big thing is whatever your promise is, now you better deliver on that damn promise, right? But then there is the evolution of it as well within this environment. And I think the ShopRite is just one example of how you can say, well, we still deliver lowest price every day guaranteed, but it's about, we are also a business who cares for our people. We also care for our customers who come into our store every day. So I think that's where I'm saying, for me, it's not about a change. I don't think this is at all the time to change. And by the way, I read the Mark Ritson article. I'm a big fan of him as well. I agree 100% with everything he said. I think it's about the little tweaks and evolution that we have to see now, that I think is interesting to see how brands are going to do that.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that it's not wholesale changes, it's tweaks and it's evolution. But a question from one of our viewers, Adam, what about those consumers who want to be involved but are not technologically confident enough to do so? How do you approach these customers in these changing times?
I think it's a great question. So in my mind, brands have a responsibility to help consumers. And if you launch something that's going to make their lives easier, I firmly don't believe in this adage of build it and they will come. I think there's a word missing after it. It's build it and they will come because. So I think we need to clearly define what value people can expect to, receive from digital platforms, but also the responsibility is, on all brands to say, how are we helping people? And we know from a psychological perspective that self-efficacy is a huge concept here that drives adoption of new technology, innovation, and digital, tools. And basically what that is people's perception about their own abilities to navigate, something like a website or a digital tool, etc. So the more that we can focus on building consumer self-efficacy when it comes to these technologies, the more inclusive we can become with our services, because we can give people greater access to things that are going to make their lives better. They're going to enhance value. And I think that's the responsibility that brands carry, is to say, don't just build something for people, build something and help them use it so that they can extract the value that you want them to ultimately achieve.
So Chris, how does this happen practically? How are brands kind of bringing consumers along for those who are having difficulty navigating this ever-changing digital space now?
Look, I think first of all, I want to build on a point that I can't remember whether Bronwyn or Claire raised a little bit earlier on, is that consumers often are further along than what we'd like them to think, right? I think if you go look as an example on, let's use the data example, I think, if I'm not mistaken, currently South Africa's biggest podcast is actually Soccer Laduma, which is a soccer magazine that is aimed at the middle to lower end market, right? I'll give you another example. Uzalo, which is an SABC1 television show, has more viewers on YouTube than Carte Blanche has on Mnet, right, with live television. So I think that the consumers actually come along very, very quickly and much faster than what we give them credit for. So I think that there's a number of examples of this as well. I mean, the other example is Bona magazine, right? Bona magazine has, I think they've got something like 8 or 9 times the amount of Facebook followers that they have actual readers of the printed platform. So I think a lot of the brands, how our consumers integrate with media types and with brands, I think actually happens very organically and very quickly, and not often dictated and necessarily narrated as brands would like it to.
Right. We have a question also from our YouTube broadcast from Claire Oliver, and she asks, what do you guys think about the growth of platforms such as TikTok across generations in this time? Perhaps, Chris, you'd like to take that one first?
Yeah, if I have to see one more TikTok video where it's somebody's dad or grandpa doing a dance or something, I think it's been amazing. Yeah, I think we've seen all of these platforms rise to the top, right? I think as consumers have more time, I mean, we saw Netflix adoption increase, DSTV increase. I saw, interesting thing enough, so I mean, we talk very much now top end consumer here, but if you go look at OpenView HD, which is the ETV, call it satellite service. I saw, I think yesterday or the day before, they announced that they had their 2 millionth subscription. So I think across the board, we're seeing this rise in audiences. as people have more time, they've got more time to access platforms, whether that be TikTok or whether that be radio dramas on SABC radio. And let's not forget about those, right? So I think overall we are seeing the growth in audiences. And the interesting thing for me as an advertising person and a person who invests money in these platforms is, at the moment, a lot of these platforms are seeing big growth in audiences, but not necessarily seeing the return from an advertising revenue perspective. But that's just a question of time again, right? Where we see, I think as the economy turns around, hopefully we'll see investment. And a lot of platforms are gearing themselves now to be ready for that turnaround.
So that was in fact going to be my next comment, is the likes of TikTok, etc., and these never-ending Facebook challenges and so on, and all the look at me show going on social media. You know, we talk about the importance of influencers and the importance of followers, etc., but what really is the impact on the bottom line for the advertiser?
So at the moment, the answer is not the answer that a lot of people want to hear. You know, there's one of my favorite sayings that I've said 100 times before is, when the tide comes in, all the boats rise, and when the tide goes out, all the boats sink, right? At the moment, the reality is that advertising spend is down and down drastically, right? So you might have a platform like whatever your platform is, and you are actually making less ad revenue at the moment, and therefore delivering less ad revenue to advertisers. I mean, a great example was there were two releases recently done by Alphabet, the holding company for Google, and Facebook themselves, that have said that they've released cautionaries on advertising revenue. In other words, they're going to be making less advertising revenue this year than what they were budgeting for, right? So I think that's just because of overall ad spend decreasing. Google makes 10% of their ad revenue from the travel industry. Travel industry is not advertising at the moment, so therefore they're losing 10%. It's a huge knock for them, just on travel industry alone. So I think but what the media owners need to be doing at the moment, and what a lot of them are doing, is gearing themselves for the turnaround. So great, if you've picked up audiences, great, now you have those audiences. You might not be able to monetize them immediately, but the turnaround is coming, and when that turnaround comes, you can monetize it and then grow from there.
So what I hear from Chris, Bronwyn, is that audience is more of a lead indicator to whether or not brands are going to see the financial return on investment in the weeks and months to come after COVID-19, after the lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you are going to want to connect with a particular target market, you should go meet them where they are. Don't expect them to come and join you wherever you are. So absolutely, brands should always be following where the market leads. That said, we've seen some interesting things happening. I think you mentioned TikTok earlier. At our Gen Z presentation that we've just released with Flex Trends, we picked up this whole phenomenon of TikTok houses being quite exceptional. And it comes back to how the whole concept of influence is shifting. So a TikTok house is basically like what Big Brother was sort of 20 years ago, where a big brand or a celebrity or an ad agency actually puts together a beautiful property and then invites young, beautiful people with large social media followings on their platform of choice, now currently TikTok, to move into this beautiful, glamorous house and just produce content for whatever that advertising agency or brand requires. So it's an entirely cynical look at what influence is. It's entirely lifting that fourth wall and exposing the whole thing that influence is really just a paid advertising campaign, but audiences are starting to be accepting of it. So those are the sort of changes in what consumers accept with regards to trust and influence that brands should be trying to capitalize on if they want to keep ahead of the trends. But always follow your market to where they're going and then take it as far as you absolutely can.
I think that's I'm going to ask for closing comments from our panel, but I think that thought is an awesome one. Brands must follow where the market leads, Bronwyn. That's a really powerful way to wrap up. And maybe if I can ask our other panelists to just leave our viewers with, as we almost reached the end of our time, to just leave our viewers with one or two final thoughts on how to navigate this shifting space that seems quite scary for a lot of brands. Bronwyn, I love that last comment, but perhaps you have something more that you'd like to add.
I think that my biggest message to any brand at the moment would be to add value and not try to extract value, particularly at this point in time. Some of the other panelists have mentioned how consumers are increasingly unforgiving of brands breaking their promises, but it's not just consumers the brands need to be afraid of in that regard, they should also be concerned of employees. Sometimes your revolution can come within. So my advice would be to make sure that you are adding value and not trying to cynically extract value, particularly in tough times.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Adam, something from you in closing, please.
Yeah, so I think I completely agree with Bronwyn's comment, but maybe my final sort of piece of advice would be, don't take consumers at their word in terms of what they want. Look at research and data that validates their preferences and their behaviors. We need to understand how people process information to understand how they're going to subsequently behave and react. And I mean, if we look at an example of, this whole, straws, plastic straws must, fall and be removed. But when we look at, actual experiments, people constantly choose plastic containers for, their food coverings. So in my mind, I think my closing comment would be apply data and research to understand what is really going to be meaningful for people. Don't necessarily take them at their word, and look for evidence what is really driving people's perceptions, behaviors, and motivations.
Wonderful. Perhaps, Chris, if you could give us a few parting shots.
Cool. I think one of my favorite sayings was, I think it was Winston Churchill who said it, is never let a good crisis go to waste. So I would say here we are, and it's a great opportunity for everybody to review what we've been doing, right? I think that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but this is a great opportunity for you to start something new. We've seen with media owners fast tracking plans and change. It's a great opportunity for you to not do what you've always been doing.
Awesome. And last but not least, Claire.
Yeah, I think I'll build on Chris's point. I think that's a really key thing, and I think it's something that we as individuals have been encouraging each other to do, is like, look at yourself, get curious about yourself. You're spending so much time alone, really journal and do all these kind of nice woo-woo things. But I think the same is true for brands. We need to get a bit self-reflective. We need to start asking ourselves those difficult questions. Realize that we are all in a state of anxiety, and I think, to Bronwyn's point, including employees, I mean, that's been a huge thing for me. Demographic has been amazing. They've organized a therapist for our organization for people to have access to, and I can't say how great that is, because I do think it's key. Get people to, both as a brand, get curious about what the brand is, and then also as employees, like, help people move through this, because it's a very difficult time. Yeah.
Thank you, Claire. So we've heard it from our panel, lots to take in there. Brands, follow where the market leads. Don't break your promise to your consumer, because we are watching you closer than ever right now, with all of these various platforms at our disposal, and with the uptake that is so completely overwhelming that Chris talks about, with people not to be underestimated. They are on these platforms, they are making use of them, and so don't break those promises. Another good thing to remember from Adam, don't take consumers purely at face value. Don't just listen to what they say. Watch what they actually do. It's not just about what we say. And don't forget to focus on your employees. And in the famous words, as Chris said, of Winston Churchill, just don't ever, never let a good crisis go to waste. So that's just about all we have time for, unfortunately. I really just want to thank our panelists. We have been completely spoiled this morning with some of the greatest minds in the advertising and anthropology space. I hope that we've all enjoyed the session, and I do look forward to our audience joining us again in future similar webinars brought to you by Arena Holdings. Again, I want to say thank you to our headline partners, Vodacom and Easy Ads, and also to the Media Shop and Proudly South Africa and Everlytic. And thank you to you, our audience, for all the fabulous questions that came through and for your engagement and involvement. We look forward to seeing you again soon.